News Radio 700 WLW.
Scott Sloan Show here on 700 WLW. On the heels of the Georgia school shooting last week, the manhunt continues for an armed and dangerous person of interest in a shooting that happened on Saturday. So around 5:30, I believe, Saturday afternoon, a gunman shot into cars driving on I-75 a few miles north of London, Kentucky. That's about 150 miles roughly from Cincinnati. It's certainly within our listening area. 5 people struck. 7, I think 9 cars had, hit by bullets from this long gun, but 5 people struck. No fatalities, thank God. There are some severe injuries. And Dr. Alex Del Carmen is here. He's from Tarleton State University, criminologist and terrorism expert, jumping on the show this morning. Dr. Alex, good morning.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in. This, to me, is one of those stories that should be a lot bigger than it is. Obviously, what the tragedy in Georgia is first and foremost when you have young people, a 14-year-old who's given a gun by his dad, and it looked like the young man was under disability from some mental issues. He still gave a gun. That's sickening is what that is. But there's going to be some closure there. You know what's going on. This one to me is bigger because I've driven in the past, and I always wonder this because I think of these things when I'm driving. I look around the foothills of Kentucky, the hills of Cincinnati, the vast space here in the Midwest and Ohio where you drive. Once you're out of the city, there's a lot of rural areas, and there's a lot of traffic on those highways. I've often thought, like, wow, if you really wanted to terrorize people, you could park yourself in a tree line on a hill somewhere in rural Ohio, Kentucky, or Indiana, and did what this guy allegedly did on Saturday, and that is take pot shots at drivers, causing the interstate to shut down. 75's massive north-south highway, arguably the biggest north-south highway in the country, and bring everything to a screeching halt and probably get away with it. You shoot at 6, 7, 9 cars. By the time they respond, you're long gone and maybe on to the next thing. We saw the D.C. sniper. It harkens back to that. But to me, this is more diabolical and also vulnerable. Would you agree?
That's exactly right. And I agree with you that this should be a bigger story. Unfortunately, I think by now, many of us in our society have become, in many ways, used to these stories. And so you sort of turn on the TV or you listen to the radio and you hear, one more shooting, people getting shot, and people are like, well, where did that happen? And, oh, that's thousands of miles away. Okay, let's talk about the national news now. And so it's very sad, but it is a reality that we're all experiencing. But I agree with you. This is a horrible incident, and it has the potential. Don't forget this, Scott. It has the potential for being a bigger story and a more catastrophic story, right? Because we don't know the end of this. We have no idea if this person is going to go to another state or perhaps has fled, to another jurisdiction and is going to do the exact same thing. And this time around, there will be casualties. In
this case, we know it's a Joseph A. Couch of Woodbine, Kentucky, close by to where the shooting was. They found a AR-15 in a wooded area adjacent to I-75 outside London, Kentucky. And so they have the gun. Presumably it is the weapon that he used in this case. He left it behind. They traced it to him. He bought it the same day, 2,000 rounds of ammo. And we can talk about, gun laws and all that other stuff. But the fact of the matter is there's nothing in his record that was significant that would prevented him from getting that gun in the first place. I hear that and go, wow, if that's the case, and we always worry about domestic terrorism and foreign terrorism and the like, and we saw what happened and lived through 9/11. We've seen other acts of terrorism around the world since then, and how easy it is for someone to get a gun and do what this guy did, except for the fact instead of leaving it, this could turn into the D.C. sniper case because we've heard of copycat individuals and being inspired by sick stuff like this and how easy it would be to get away with this. I would say if he didn't leave the gun, how would you catch someone like that? That's almost impossible, isn't it?
It would have been very hard. One of our biggest tools in the law enforcement profession has been the usage of the cell phone by bad guys, right? Mm-hmm. And so there would have been a possibility that we would have been able to ping perhaps the presence of a cell phone in the area at that time and then come up with a list and then go down that list and figure out, who the bad guy perhaps is. But there's no question that finding a weapon and being able to trace it back to fingerprints or whatnot, it's a much better and more specific type of trace that allows us to now have a face and a name next to the suspect.
Yeah, in the South, but you're also on 75, and so how many hundreds of cars are passing by while they're there, and now that feels more like a needle in a haystack.
It would have been, but believe me when I tell you that these investigators and these detectives are really, really good at what they do.
Mm-hmm.
We had an incident like that here in Texas, in Arlington, Texas, where an officer lost his life, and we couldn't find out, we didn't know for many months, rather, who the person was that had actually killed him and ran into him. And then what we found out afterwards is through cell phone technology, we were able to deduct who the bad guy was, and he was eventually apprehended. So that does happen. We have the capability of doing it, but it's a very long and arduous process.
Yeah, and you're driving right now, probably listening to the show, and Dr. Alex Del Carmen's on. He's a criminologist and terrorism expert, talking about the Kentucky shooting that should get more play than it does. I mean, it is making headlines to be sure, but the significance of this is that, man, we have so many unguarded highways and just places to hide that it wouldn't take much effort to replicate this kind of crime and tragedy and have that repeat by some lunatic with an agenda. Now, this guy looks like it's a one-off for him, premeditated for sure. It doesn't appear that the individuals in the cars are targeted. I'm just trying to think. Normally we see, all right, I guess the 14-year-old had some issues with bullying at school. What's scary about this is here's a guy with literally nothing of significance in his record going on a shooting spree against total strangers. That really scares me.
Yeah, that we know of at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know what the triggers have been. We have no idea if there's a digital signature or fingerprint in his record that he left something behind that could actually give us a sense of why he's doing what he's doing. So far, what we know is he served in the National Guard. He was an engineer in the National Guard, and we also know that, by virtue of that, he knows how to use weapons and has been trained to kill, right? So those issues are challenges for law enforcement right now, especially that the guy can blend in, is from the area, and knows exactly where to go. The fact that we found one weapon, it doesn't mean that he can't have access to others, right? Or that he may have other weapons in his possession. So he's still very much a danger and a threat to everybody in the community.
Yeah, he was a person of interest, and now he is a suspect. Explain that nuance and the difference and what may have happened that led him to that.
Yeah, it's basically, we were able to trace his fingerprints to the weapon, and therefore now he's no longer a person of interest that we like to talk to and sort of disqualify, as somebody potentially that pulled the trigger. Now we have more specific information that legally allows us to call him, a suspect, which means that, he is basically linked to the weapon of choice in this particular crime, and we believe and we're treating him as somebody who is, in fact, the bad guy, except that it has to be proven in a court of law.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a plot, a well-thought-out one. If you leave the gun with your fingerprints on that you just bought that morning, it seems like something else was going on there.
Yeah, and I think that part of it also is what we do know, however, is we know that, and law enforcement believes that he actually premeditated the attack, not necessarily the people that he was going to target, right? So in other words, this is just basically somebody that says, I'm going to go to the highway and I'm going to start shooting at people. And those that were actually passing by are the unfortunate souls that were shot at. But the reality is, at the end of the day, what matters is that there are innocent people that have been shot at. Possibly some of them could have died, and we just don't know what we don't know about what he's going to do, today or tomorrow.
The contrast with this, though, I think it's interesting, is the minute you hear this, you go, wow, it's the Beltway sniper again. And if you go back 20 years, Lee Malvo, I believe, was the man's name, and had an accomplice, a younger man that he helped recruit. But he's driving around D.C., and from a little, a little hole in the back of his car, that little flap he would lay down, he'd lay down in the prone position and fire shots in D.C., and we're talking about heavily populated areas, unlike what we're talking about in rural Kentucky here. But still, that terrorism went on for a long time before he was finally apprehended. This one has some parallels, but also a lot of distinctions, the differences.
Right, and then on top of that, technology has advanced, right, in the past 20 years. And so now we have cell phones, we have satellite components, we have, license plate readers in the streets. We have a much larger capability to be able to track somebody down. I'm not saying that this person is going to be caught in the next 24 to 48 hours. But what I am saying, though, is that I'm rather optimistic about the fact that I think it's not going to take us as long to catch the bad guy in this case, given the technology that we have.
So frightening, too, Dr. Del Carmen, that you're driving down the highway in 75, pretty mundane kind of drive. You're driving away from London, Kentucky, about 150 miles from Cincinnati. All of a sudden, glass is shattering and there's loud noises. And my God, I'm driving my car. Next thing I know, I'm bleeding and wondering what the hell just happened here. Wow, that is so traumatic for anyone involved in this. It's sickening.
It is, and I think that that's exactly what it's trying to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
More so than actually, hurt people physically, is the idea of psychologically imposing terror. The idea of ensuring that, people, when they drive down that highway, they either take alternative routes or they simply are, saying a prayer as they drive down the road because they have no idea if they're going to be the next targeted entity. And so, look, domestic terrorism is exactly how the word describes it, right?
Yeah.
It's somebody that on the domestic front is trying to inflict a psychological terror on everyone in the community so that all of us become, keenly aware of this person's existence, and we curtail our behavior based on what that person's threat we think it's going to be and how that's going to come up against us.
Yeah, and this coupled with what just happened in Georgia late last week as well with the shooting there. This happens on Saturday, the shooting in London, Kentucky, outside of London, Kentucky. And we're in a political season. We're always in the political season, but it's hard and heavy now past Labor Day as the sprint towards November continues. And I would expect Democrats, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, to make hay of these issues, politically speaking, and exploit them for political gain, as they would often do. Politicians do that. And the fact that this guy bought an AR-15 and 2,000 rounds of ammo the same morning, people are screaming about gun laws and getting rid of that. From your perspective, how did that work? It's you're calling for something, and I get that Democrats often look for a utopia. In a land of the Second Amendment and 300+ million people, it seems awfully difficult to weed someone out and go, well, there should be a waiting period even if you are perfectly sane. And even still, aren't you just going to do that shooting at a later point? To simply say, well, we got to ban guns, you're going to hear a lot of that out of this. But what does that achieve? It doesn't achieve anything.
Well, I stay away from politics as best as I can, and I can't blame people that do. And I will tell you, just looking at the science of it all, right? I'm a criminologist, and I've been doing this for 27 years, and I can tell you that the science is just not there, right? It's not supporting that particular political perspective, in the sense that when you look at it from the standpoint of the millions of guns that are sold every single day and the usage of one, it doesn't necessarily mean that curtailing the usage of guns itself is going to actually promote, a better type of or safer type of environment. I argue that bad guys are going to get a hold of weapons regardless of whether they can legally buy them or not. The bottom line, though, is that our society is becoming more violent, and that people are doing things that in the past we only would perhaps buy the 1984 George Orwell book and say, gee, that could never happen in the United States. Well, we're seeing now that things are happening at a worse level than we ever imagined. And we just don't know what we don't know about what the future holds. What we do know, however, is that the pandemic and various other components that happened in recent history are attributors in many ways to what we conceive now to be the madness around us of the violence that is increasing across the world.
Yeah, I push back a little on that one, too, because and I'm not disagreeing with you on that. It feels like, there's more attacks and gun incidents and things like that. But society, even 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, was a lot more violent as today. I mean, you look at what was legal just a few years ago, and you could physically assault your wife if you wanted to be a great example of beat your kids. And now we have laws that rightly so, have outlawed all that behavior. But, you go back to the good old days, were they really that good in terms of violence? Because, lynchings were common not all that long ago, and people would just get away with it. That's an extremely violent murder is what that is. And those are just talked up to the times that we lived in.
Yeah, and I'll add something to that not hopefully will make you change your mind, but for you to consider in that premise is the fact that back then we also did not report crime the way we do now, and oftentimes what we have now is we have the technology, the ability, the acceptance socially that people, if a wife is beaten up, there are chances that she's going to pick up 911 or go online or go to somebody's home and say, hey, by the way, my husband or my partner beat me up and I need help. Whereas in the past that was not only not accepted, but it was not tolerated.
Yes. And
that person was almost always in disbelief that that this would have actually happened to that person. So I would argue that the laws have changed, that the way we communicate crime has changed, and therefore it's really difficult to gauge what the past is in terms of like levels of violence versus where we are today. So anyway, look, bottom line is we got a bad guy in the loose. People need to be careful. And people need to be aware of their surroundings at all times and report it as soon as they see it.
Yeah, unfortunately, it looks like they've got the one. I don't have in custody yet. They're still looking for this individual out of Woodbine, Kentucky. Joseph Couch is his name. He's 32 years old, and there's plenty of descriptions and I guess pictures of him all over the place too. That's still looking for this guy. Fortunately, it was a one-off, but it's kind of concerning because you look at this and go, wow, it doesn't take much for someone who is maybe a foreign or domestic terrorist to repeat what happened in D.C. 20 years ago and go on a shooting rampage from rural areas towards highways. And that would absolutely wreak havoc with our economic structure and certainly transportation, because that's the heart of it. Dr. Alex Del Carmen at Tarleton State University is a criminologist and terrorism expert. Thanks for jumping in this morning. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Yeah, be well.